Let us pray. Lord, once again, we come to this beautiful place to worship, asking that you open our hearts and our minds with your very presence, so that as these scriptures are lifted up and your word proclaimed, we might hear this morning with joy what you'd have to say to us this day. Amen. I am told a pastor stood at the door of his church following an Easter service, shaking everyone's hand as they exited. And when this particular boy, young fella, got to him, he grabbed him by the hand and pulled him to the side. And he leaned forward into the young man's face and he said, "Son, it's about time you joined the army of the Lord." And the young man was kind of startled and he said, "But Pastor, I'm already in the army of the Lord." And the pastor said, "Well, why do I only see you at Easter and Christmas?" And the young man leaned forward and he said, "It's because I'm in the secret service." Television mogul, cablevision mogul, I should say, Ted Turner was given a humanist award back in the 90s. And he gave a speech in Orlando. And in that speech, he talked about growing up in a very fundamentalist family. And he said he actually thought about becoming a missionary at one point. And he said he was probably saved 7 or 8, maybe even 9 times in those early years. Of course, he was being very cynical with that. Then his sister became ill, and he prayed for her healing. He said he prayed fervently for her healing. And then she died. He said he became totally disenchanted with Christianity. And over time he realized the further he got away from Christianity and faith, the better he felt. Falling away. At the request of his father, Karl Marx was baptized at the age of 7 into the evangelical established church. And his early writings exhibited a sincere spirituality, a spirituality that suggested that he wanted to give his life to God, lay down his life to God for humanity. Later at Berlin University, he fell under the influence of a young charismatic lecturer in theology by the name of Bruno Bauer. Bauer had come to believe the Christian Gospels were not historical fact, but instead humanity's childish emotional fears and needs being expressed in story and tale. He also proclaimed that there was a social revolution at hand greater than anything Christianity could ever imagine. Soon, Marx began to think on power structures and systems and sociology that would lead him to say that Christianity and all religions were simply opiate of the masses, a drug that makes people tolerate their existence or the place they have in society. And then he dedicated his book, Das Kapital, to Charles Darwin, who was also a previous Anglican theology student who became an agnostic and wrote Natural Selection and the Origin of Species. Falling away. Most of us remember the Billy Graham Crusades. Thousands would pack into football stadiums for 3 nights of preaching and singing. And each night there would be an altar call, and thousands would respond to the singing of Just As I Am. You remember? Yeah, Just As I Am. And there were some sociology students at a university that were fascinated with all of this and wanted to know the deeper emotional, spiritual aspects of it. So they began to study the Billy Graham Crusades. And what they discovered actually shocked them. They found that after a year, only 10% of those who went to the altar made their way into the life of a church. A year later, only 10% of those were in the life of a church. And 3 years after that, only 10% of those were in a Christian church. What they discovered is that as the emotion faltered and failed, as the goosebumps went away, as the enthusiasm diminished, people started falling away. After nearly 40 years in Christian ministry, I've seen many come into the faith, and I've seen many fall from the faith. I've seen members come, and I've seen members go, some more than once. Let's face it, there is little loyalty to denominations today, or even to particular churches. If the toast gets burned at this church, people just pack their tents and camp out in the next church park. Of course, there is that cycle, too. You know the cycle. You may have gone through it. You may have had your children to go through it. Parents will attend church while their children are at home, but when the kids go off to college, the parents go off somewhere else. The parents seem to get free of church once the children go off to college. And the children return at Easter and Christmas, and so do the parents, maybe a few times during the summer months. Then when they get married and the children come, the parents and the grandparents slowly drift back to church. Maybe a funeral here and there. But even that is thinning and getting less and less. People are going and not coming back, falling away. It seems you and I live in an age of falling away. Talk to anyone in a lodge or a civic group or in a club or some other volunteer group, and they will tell you the numbers are thinning. It's getting harder and harder to keep the organizations vibrant and alive. Some are closing. People are not joining, and those who were once strong participants are now attending, every now and again. Not with the regularity that they once did. Then, of course, there's the Christian church. And I've been studying graphs over the past few weeks and months, and I'm shocked. One graph I saw of attendance in the United States over the past 60 years, and it looks like a graph that came out of the Great Depression. It's like this. Over 60 years, it's been steadily declining, and it's been doing so in such a slow, deliberate rate, we haven't gotten alarmed by it. It's sort of like that frog in the beaker in the science lab, and the water's getting hotter and hotter, and the frog doesn't know it's getting cooked. It just thinks the water's warmer. Well, in reverse, that's what's been happening to the Christian church as the world, the nation that we reside in, has gotten more secular, more consumeristic, more materialistic, and the church has begun to dwindle, and we just didn't notice it. It's even worse for the mainline denominations who have had a difficult time adjusting to social and cultural changes. And it appears, I'm no expert, but it appears each generation has become less and less committed to the church and more secular in its attitude and philosophy than the previous generation. So through that period of 60 years, the church has become less and less relevant. People just don't think they need the church anymore. In our postmodern world, there are too many things to do, too many things to see, not enough time to do them all. So I'll go to church once or twice a month, maybe 2 or 3 times a quarter, maybe at Easter and Christmas. Yeah, God has been pushed further and further away. Well, you know, Stephen Hawking, that theoretical physicist and cosmologist, has said God was not necessary for creation. And, of course, the History Channel is telling us that aliens seeded us on the planet Earth. So God was not necessary for human origin either. And then some secular institutions say that Jesus was just a figment of some well-intended Jews who wanted to change the world 2,000 years ago. Falling away. I'm comforted remembering how people have been falling away for the last 21 centuries. It's nothing new. It's been going on since Jesus sat there that day with that horde of disciples. People have been falling away. While many loyal Christians suffered martyrdom during the first 3 centuries, many also fell away. During the Enlightenment, the church was attacked by philosophers like Voltaire, who said, "Christianity is the most ridiculous and the most absurd and bloody religion that has ever infected the world." Falling away. I'm also reminded that in the book that John wrote about the revelation that he had, that when God's hand pulls the curtain on human history, just before that takes place, there will be a great falling away from the church. Now, whether we are in that now or not, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's happened before, many times, and it may happen in the future again and again. I don't know. I just know what he wrote. And I must confess, I'm almost comforted knowing that even Jesus experienced a falling away. His congregation dwindled. His attendance declined. Many found fault in him and turned away. They're still grumbling. They're still complaining. They still don't get it, and many are leaving. And no, this is not the 21st century secular-minded postmodern church member who now has better things to spend their time on Sunday morning or listening to a boring, long sermon. These are followers of Jesus and the greatest preacher and teacher who ever lived. Their attention span has just completely run out. They've heard the teachings. They've seen the miracles. They have gotten all they can get out of the carpenter. He's just fed them bread and fish from a young boy's picnic lunch. He's filled their stomachs, and they've gotten all they can get from him. They even chased him on the other side of the lake asking for more, and when he didn't give it to them, they're ready to fall away. You see, Jesus doesn't want them to follow at a distance. He wants to be up close. He wants to be personal in this relationship. He wants them to be a part of him and he a part of them. He says, "Eat my flesh. Drink my blood." You see, he's calling them closer. But they're wanting to fall away. You know how it is. You know how it is when somebody's mind is made up, they're going to do it. They have excuses, but they're going to try to find a reason. And Jesus seems to have given it to them. He starts talking about eating flesh and drinking blood. And what's interesting for me here is when he talks about it earlier in the text, he uses one word about eat. And now he says, he changes it to a different word. It's a word that means gnaw. G-N-A-W, gnaw. Gnaw on me. Gnaw on me. Chew on me. Gnaw. Our daughter has a little beagle puppy, Harper. Frisky little thing. Like a yo-yo. And the only way to deviate her from other things is to give her a bone. And when Nancy gives her the bone, nothing else matters. She is focused in. She is locked in. She is gnawing on that bone. And Jesus is telling these disciples, these would-be disciples, to gnaw on him. I remember years ago, we had a medical, it wasn't a convention, but a get-together at the Four Seasons Steakhouse on Pine Street in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Hospital administrator, doctors, nurses, and the whole medical, emergency medical personnel were there. And we had this lovely meal. And across from me was a man named Robert Johnson, affable fella. And he was very polite during his meal. He used his napkin, and, he didn't chew with his mouth open or anything like. He even wiped his mouth before he drank out of the water glass. Very, he was okay. And then when the meal finished, to everyone's horror, Robert reaches down and picks up the T-bone off the plate, and he begins to gnaw. Like this, and everybody is just horrified, watching him. And I mean, for 3 or 4 minutes, he nibbles every piece of meat off that bone until it's slick. And he chunks it back on the plate, and he says, "Best T-bone I ever ate." Gnaw. That's what Jesus wants us to do with him. It's to gnaw on him. The gospel is not penny-laced. It's not silk. It's burlap. It's not Madison Avenue. It's alleyway. It's not Park Avenue. It's a dirt road with potholes. It's not clean. The gospel calls us into places we would never go before. To touch those we would never touch. To get close to those we would never become close to. To serve the least of these and have relationships with the worst of those. No. And then Jesus turns to those 12 disciples who were closer to him than the rest, and he asks them point blank, "Do you wish to go away too?" Can you hear the pain in his voice? Do you wish to go away also? Are you going to leave me? I love Peter's down-to-earth response. Where are we going to go? We've heard you preach. We've heard you teach. We've seen the miracles. We believe in you. We trust in you. We're in this thing with you. We may not understand everything. We may not understand you. But we trust you, however, and we've come to believe you are the Holy One of God. There's nowhere else for us to go. I've often wondered how Jesus was feeling. He seems troubled. He seems downhearted. Maybe he was even depressed. He just came off the greatest miracle the world has ever known, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. And it wasn't enough for them. They wanted more. And he was trying to take them from the physical to the spiritual relationship. And they didn't want to go. They'd rather keep it on the physical. Attendance is waning, membership is declining, followers are thinning, seemingly because of one sermon, and apparently one phrase in that sermon, a preacher's nightmare. But Jesus doesn't go running after them, apologizing for what he said, with a sackcloth full of suckers, begging them to retake their pew. No. What he said is true. What he said is the gospel. And you can't change truth, and you can't change the gospel to suit. When you gnaw on Jesus, like Harper, like Robert Johnson, you're absorbed, you're enthralled, you're engrossed, you're captivated. You're into him and he's into you. The gospel, you see, is not a child's story with a sentimental ending. It's a way of life that moves and has its meaning in God. You gnaw on Jesus, and your last thought is to walk away. Your dominant thought is to get even closer. To get closer. Yeah, our society and culture has walked away from Jesus and the church. There are many who are falling away from the church, who were in the church. The church has lost its place in the world. And again, we are seemingly irrelevant to the majority of people. Yet, now listen, there's hope. There is hope. Recognizing the problem and seeing the darkness doesn't mean there's hope. It is not hope. There is hope. If you go back in church history, every time it was the darkest, light came next. After the persecution of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century Rome, then came Constantine and the explosion of the Christian faith throughout the world. With the cynicism of the Enlightenment came the Great Awakening and the preaching of John Wesley and Martin Luther and Zwingli and all those other folks. The church was reborn. And I think the same thing can happen today. But it's not going to happen by passing laws. It will not happen by offering flashy programs. It will not happen with an army of Joel Osteens filling every pulpit in the United States. It will begin when those called by his name will humble themselves and recommit themselves to loyalty to the gospel and dedication to the kingdom, and remain faithful before a hostile secular world, gnawing on Jesus with their mouths gaping open, showing the world who and what you're chewing on, unashamedly, unembarrassed, and living out faith boldly before others. If we do that, I believe, sincerely believe, we can see a rebirth of faith. You know, I heard a bishop say one time, and I think I shared it here with you before, but I'm going to repeat myself if I did. Set your church on fire and the whole neighborhood will come to watch it burn. And that's our task. Mixing my metaphors, if we gnaw on Jesus, others are going to come and want to gnaw with us if they see what is happening to us and how it is changing us. Now, either we're growing closer to Jesus or we are drifting further apart. Ask yourselves this morning about that relationship. Is your spiritual life the same as it was a few years ago? Is it better? Or maybe is it weaker? So Jesus asks you and me today, will you also go away? I hope we can answer with Peter, Lord, after eating and drinking from your cup, where could we go? With your help, we'll always be here for you. Amen.